The Magic Mountains, a 1924 novel by the German writer Thomas Mann. Mann was born into a middle-class family in Lübeck in 1875. He published his first short story in 1898 and his first novel, Buddenbrooks, in 1901. Other novels, including The Magic Mountain, followed, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929. He moved to Switzerland in 1933 after Hitler gained power. And in 1939, he and his wife, who was Jewish, left for the USA. In 1952, he went back to Switzerland, where he died 3 years later at the age of 80. This review contains spoilers. The Magic Mountain was originally meant to be a light-hearted short story, a humorous companion to Mann's highly sombre and controversial novella, Death in Venice, which he published in 1912. However, it grew to become, in Mann's own words, a thumping 2-volume novel. It is possible for a work to have its own will and purpose, he wrote apologetically later. Perhaps a far more ambitious one than the author's. It's about a young man called Hans Castorp, whom Mann describes as simple-minded but shrewd. Castorp arrives at a sanatorium in the Swiss Alps for a short visit to his cousin Joachim, who's suffering from tuberculosis. But during that visit, Castorp himself is diagnosed with a respiratory illness. So it eventually lasts 7 years. There are scores of author-initiated philosophical digressions on the exact nature of time, terminating with the advent of World War I and Castorp's recruitment as yet another bit of cannon fodder. During those 7 years, he falls in love with an enigmatic Eastern European called Claudia Schauschat, meets two émigrés with diametrically opposed worldviews, experiences the death of his cousin and others, gets lost during a blizzard, and assists at a séance. It's not much of a story, more a series of set pieces linked by a single protagonist. There are long passages of what we'd probably today call information dump, and even filler. For several pages towards the end, Mann gives the reader a detailed breakdown of the plot of 3 operas, simply so he can say, these were Hans Castorp's favourite records. And there's one chapter that's almost entirely in French. It can feel like a struggle. I remember reading a review of The Magic Mountain in a literary supplement about 20 years ago. The reviewer made it sound exciting. Hans Castorp arrives at a sanatorium and gets caught up in highly topical discussions about the state of the world and what should be done about it. In fact, it's nothing like that. The 2 significant intellectuals in the novel, Lodovico Settembrini and Leo Nafta, represent positions that might have been current in the first half of the 19th century, but certainly weren't at the beginning of the 20th. It's a mystery why they feel the passionate need to refute each other, or why Mann feels the need to tell us virtually everything they say. They're living in the back of beyond, and even if one of them was to best the other in argument, we've no reason to think anything would change. Mann tells us they're battling for the soul of Hans Castorp, which might work if the soul of Hans Castorp was worth fighting for. But even Mann doesn't hold him in high esteem. It's impossible to discuss this novel without thinking of Vladimir Nabokov's judgment upon it. Nabokov held Mann in extremely low regard, considering him a puffed-up writer of plodding and garrulous topical trash. Mann's work, he said, was filled with insubstantial cliches, sham psychology, and phony great ideas. The Magic Mountain in particular was plodding and garrulous, and populated by characters built to fulfill predetermined ends. Mann may have intuited something of that himself. In 1952, he wrote a postscript to the novel called The Making of the Magic Mountain, arguably the culmination of a long series of attempts, partly by the author himself, partly by his fans, to read into it more than is actually there. In that reinterpretation, Leo Nafta becomes the Hegelian Marxist George Lukács, Claudia Schauschat becomes both Venus and Circe, and Hans Castorp becomes Parsifal of the Holy Grail fame. None of those readings finds much support in the novel itself. They look suspiciously like after-the-fact wishful thinking. I'm with Nabokov on this. The Magic Mountain could have been a great novel, As it stands, it's a missed opportunity, although it undoubtedly contains the seeds of something significant. My feeling is that for it to work as it might have, the protagonist would have to have been greater. Unfortunately, Mann was unable to let go of him in his initial conception as a simple personality. A novel can only be as great as its protagonist. You might disagree.